But France also tried a fiat currency. When Louis the XIV, that's 14, I think.
14, yes. That's 14, yes.
France was in so much debt that taxation did not even cover the interest payments. And so this guy named John Law was appointed as head of a new central bank. And he started printing paper currency and expanding the money supply. And this, of course, created a bubble. And you had this appearance of prosperity everywhere. And so he was rewarded with more power, and he thought, hey, like, I printed this much money, and things went really well, so I should print some more. So he printed even more money. And this kept going. New houses were built in every direction. Prosperity looks like it was everywhere. And it looks like, nothing could possibly touch this newfound prosperity. However, of course, bubbles always pop. And so eventually prices started to skyrocket because of all this money. And the public realized that they couldn't cash out their notes for gold and silver. And then they basically, they tried to convert their notes to anything of real value, and then the currency just dropped like a rock and collapsed. And then you also have the classic Weimar Republic example. It inflated its currency to pay for war. And then, so yeah, I'll just skip that. I think you guys know that. So, any questions?
You touched on the fact that China may or may not have large gold reserves. China also has an unsustainable debt model. Talk about a bubble. That is the Chinese economy. And there were a lot of articles 3-4 years ago about the United States losing its position, the U.S. dollar losing its position as the world reserve currency. And you haven't seen those articles because there really isn't any replacement. I mean, the euro isn't gold backed. No other currency is gold backed. What do you all see as the precipitate event that would lead to the U.S. losing its position as the world's reserve currency? Since, at least in my opinion, there isn't a viable alternative.
I don't know. It's hard to predict what events trigger something like that. I heard someone say once, you can know, with the rule of finance, you can know the when, but not the, you can know the what or the when, but not both. And so you can kind of know the theory behind, what's going to cause something to happen. You can't know exactly what the point that's going to pop the bubble is. And so I'm not exactly sure. Maybe another recession or depression causes people to just go crazy. But I don't have to answer that. Anyone else?
No one, thought that London would lose its reserve currency status in the late 20s. It was kind of like just everyone assumed it was going to be the reserve currency forever, and then in the late 20s it printed too many pounds, couldn't redeem them in its base currency, silver, yeah, and went bankrupt and lost reserve currency status. And so these have happened in the 20th century, and usually before it happens, no one ever thinks it's going to happen. So there's precedent for a world reserve currency losing its status.
I also think one of the reasons why the U.S. dollar is still holding on to its position is because of all the turmoil with the European central banks. The euro will end up crashing probably before the dollar does, and that's one of the reasons why it's still holding on at the moment.
Oh, and we also know, though, there's lots of efforts to get around the U.S. petrodollar. So we're now seeing direct trade convertibility between the renminbi or yuan or whatever you want to call it, various countries. So Russia can sell oil for gold or for renminbi directly without bypassing the U.S., which is also known as the petrodollar, which gives it this tremendous it's a natural demand. You need dollars to pay for oil. So any country that needs oil needs dollars, but everyone's trying to circumvent that, and when that happens,
it'll get interesting.
Yes, then we'll get into
Oh, it doesn't have to be like an on-off switch, too. Just as more countries start, using direct deals with their own currencies or with oil or gold, oil for
Bypassing the
gold,
dollar.
that just means dollars aren't being used. And so the more dollars are used, kind of the more the Fed can export its inflation. The less dollars are used, that limits its power. And so it's kind of just a trade-off between that.
Well, there needs to be an alternative. That was Brad's point.
Yeah.
Was that China was big enough that if China wasn't a basket case, China could, in theory, pick it up. In the 1920s, there was the United States, and there was also Germany. It was a very large economy too, even though it was very volatile. So there were things to replace the pound sterling. If there's not China.
Well, the IMF is also being floated, just using the SDRs from the IMF as a reserve currency, which seems to me like the more likely thing. If something's going to replace the dollar, I feel like the IMF is working in the current corners to do it, so that's what I would suspect.
I think there are plenty of options. It's just probably going to be surprising whatever ends up happening.
Yeah.
So, in continuing this discussion, so I'm going to talk about the legal tender laws and sort of the constitutionality Supreme Court rulings on them. So first, legal tender is defined as a government mandate that you must use a certain form of currency in order to repay debts, public and private. Right, so you see that little note on the dollar bill all the time. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. And what happens when you do that is you generally end up creating a form of Gresham's law, right? Gresham's law.
I'm sorry, what was it?
Gresham's law.
Gresham's law.
Gresham.
Gresham.
Crescent.
So it's often misstated as
Gresham.
bad money drives out good. So there's always other options to use to trade, right? You can use Bitcoin now to trade instead of using dollars. And what happens with legal tender is that one money will tend to be overvalued in comparison with all the other monies. So to restate Gresham's law more properly, the artificially overvalued money will find its way in circulation and the artificially undervalued money will be hoarded. And so what happened in 1862 as a war measure, as Catherine pointed out, that's the most common precipitator for legal tender laws and inflation. Abraham Lincoln's administration passed the Legal Tender Act, which mandated greenbacks as payment for all debts to the U.S. government. And that was instigated under Secretary of Treasury at the time, Selman P. Chase. He'll come into the story a little bit later. Constitutionally, however, they can't do this, right? In Article 1, Section 8, they're granted the power to coin money, not print money. It specifically says coin. And it's been noted many times throughout the Federalist Papers, throughout Jefferson and Madison's own writings, that coin meant stamping metal, not paper. That's right, they had the experience with the Continental being completely devalued throughout the independence. So, Article 1, Section 8, they have the power to coin money and to regulate the value thereof, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the current coin of the United States. And it's interesting to note that the federal government only has jurisdiction over 3 crimes: piracy, which it leaves to Congress to define; treason, which is explicitly defined; and counterfeiting the coin.
That's today?
That's it. That's
Really?
all they really have jurisdiction over. Clearly, they have not listened to this, but those are the only federal crimes.